Right. We are now talking about theme, which is something that seems to be a little intimidating sometimes to students. So let's talk about what do we mean when we say what's the theme of this writing? Um, a theme, you know, like I said, sometimes it seems scary, like this theme is a mysterious thing that only a select few understand. Like, I didn't understand where people were coming from when we read books and they said the theme was this or that. And we'd want to demystify that a little bit um, as we talk about this today. It's not the topic. And that's where people sometimes feel like, oh, well, then it must be some mysterious thing that I can't figure out. But it's not a mysterious thing. You just have to understand there's two different um, parts we could talk about with a story like this. We talk about the topic of the story and then talk about the theme of the story. Because the theme is the big picture, what the story says about life, not just what it says about the characters in that story. A big question, a big picture item could be something like obsession. Now, there's a lot of ways that you could tell a story that would have to do with obsession. If you've read Wuthering Heights that I've mentioned before, obsession was definitely the problem with Heathcliff and his obsession with Kathy. If you've read Frankenstein, Frankenstein is about obsession. It's one of the themes of it, Frankenstein's obsession with science and wanting to create life and what happened as a result of his obsession. If you've read Macbeth, one of the themes of Macbeth is obsession. The obsession of Lady Macbeth and Macbeth with power and also his obsession with his wife, and so he will do what she says even though he knows it's wrong. Each of these has a different topic. The topic of Frankenstein is much different than the topic of Macbeth, but they both have a theme of obsession. The big question. What is it? What is the big question about life that story answers? Everything in the work comes together to create this theme. The plot and characters, the setting, the point of view, the symbols, all the literary elements are going to work together to create the idea that the big question that the author is trying to answer or ask. Quite often they actually don't answer the question, but they kind of ask the question and then they leave the reader to answer it. One of the things that good literature does is create these questions about life that we then think through and keep thinking through after we've finished reading it. I think that A Rose for Emily is a good story that quite often students keep thinking about afterwards, and it kind of comes back and you're thinking, you know, what was the deal with her and the dead guy in her house, and why did her dad never let her marry, and why did the city, you start thinking through these things, and Faulkner doesn't necessarily give you the answer, but he looks for you to create some answers of your own, possibly. So many stories might have the same topics or subjects, but different themes. As I said, many have different topics, but similar themes. So alternatively, some have similar topics, but different themes. For instance, there's many romantic novels in the world, but they could each be asking a different question about life. If you like to read Jane Austen, people sometimes feel like hers are about romance. To a small degree they are, but really she asks bigger questions about life. Where, for instance, a Harlequin romance is pretty much about just the guy and the girl getting together. Jane Austen's guy and girl that are going to get together have a lot deeper questions, a lot more growth. And so while they could both look like possibly something about romance or love, they each ask very different questions about life. There's many adventure stories in the world. Some of you might like to read adventure stories, but they could each be asking a different question about life. So, for instance, the story Leiningen versus the Ants is a story where a farmer, or I guess you'd say a plantation owner more like, has to protect his investment from a herd of army ants. And so it's kind of about the triumph of the human over the difficulties of nature, where Heart of Darkness is kind of where a character gets lost in Africa, gets sucked into the things going on there. So they're both very much adventure stories, but they have completely different themes of what's going on, what they're saying about life. At the beginning chapters of the book, where we had the story of a sorrowful woman versus the one that was about a secret sorrow, they were both about marriage, how marriage would affect a person, but they have very different questions about life and very different answers about life. So topic and theme do not equate. You have to think what's the topic, what are we actually talking about, and then by talking about that, what big question are we asking, or what big statement are we making about life? Different people can see different themes in the same story. So if you're thinking, well, back when we read such and such, in class, everybody saw this and I saw something different. That's okay. Different people will see different questions about life and different answers about life. But just remember that not all interpretations are valid. So you and someone else may disagree about what the theme says, but you have to be able to use textual evidence to support that. And quite often, you may be able to make the text support your theme. They can make the text support their theme. So both in those two interpretations are correct. But if someone wants to make the text say something it doesn't, then their interpretation would not be a proper interpretation. So they don't have to be the same, but they do have to be supported by the text. Quite often, multiple readings are necessary to see how everything's tying together, because the first time you read through something, you didn't have a reason to notice certain things at the beginning that by the end you realize that might have been important, and going back and looking at that makes you draw everything together, tie it together. The first simple kind of literal reading probably won't bring that to you. So ways to help you look for a theme, help you articulate the theme of a story. The title should mean something. The title will almost always give you a clue, whether it's ironic, whether it's sarcastic, something, it'll still usually give you a clue. You are looking for that potential symbolism. Symbolism is quite often directly leading to the theme. Look for potential growth or change in a protagonist. I mentioned Heart of Darkness. In the book Heart of Darkness, one of the main characters that's talked about all the way through, we really don't meet him till the end, has a dramatic change from he leaves England to go to Africa to manage a station, and there's when they finally find him, he has had a dramatic change from when he left England. So that will definitely point towards what the theme is. When you're stating your theme, be sure that it is not just a word like revenge, but that it makes a point. So revenge is more destructive to the person taking revenge than to the person on whom he takes it. You can see there's quite a bit of difference. The first one is just a word. That would be a topic. The second one gives us this big question about life. The theme will not be a specific statement about one character or place, but a generalized statement that could fit many stories, because remember, it's a big question about life. It's not about this topic. Don't use cliches as a theme. They're too easy. They're not deeply thought out. They're not your words. You say something like every cloud has a silver lining. That's just too easy. You're not going to see that as a theme. You need to think much more deeply. Or, there's no place like home. Those are too easy, too surface. They're not deeply thought about. Now, be aware that much light or genre fiction doesn't have strong themes, which, in my spare time if I'm reading for fun, I'm going to read detective stories. They don't really have a strong theme. They're usually based, the plot's why I'm reading it, or the characterization is why I'm reading it. Where when I read something like Bartleby the Scrivener or A Rose for Emily, I'm going to think a lot more deeply about what the author is trying to say about life. When I'm doing my pleasure reading, I'm just enjoying the characters or enjoying the plot. So they're different types of reading. So a few last thoughts on theme. Don't work so hard to find a theme on the first reading that you don't enjoy the story. I said this with symbolism too. Most good literature can be enjoyed without having to think that deeply about it on the first try. However, the story becomes much more enjoyable if you take the time to reread it, or reread sections of it, or read the beginning or whatever, and spend that time thinking about what the author is trying to say to you, particularly in a literature class, because you're going to be asked in a literature class. But even when you're not, rereading parts of it, or taking the time, once you're familiar with a story, taking the time to really think, why did the author write this? What is he trying to say to me? Makes the story much more satisfying and enjoyable.